Pregnant wife disappears. Dark secrets unveiled, true crime mystery. What happens when a pregnant wife vanishes without a trace? A chilling true crime story full of dark secrets, shocking twists, and an unexpected betrayal. But the real question is, who can you trust when everyone is hiding something? Stay tuned till the end. You won't believe the truth behind this deadly game. The storm raged outside, its howl piercing the night air. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards broke the stillness. Rachel paced back and forth in the dimly lit living room. Her eyes darted to the clock. 10:47 p.m. She had called him at least 20 times. No answer. Her thoughts spiraled, her heart pounding louder with each passing minute. Where was he? Where was Brian? The door creaked open. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was him, but there was something wrong. The look in his eyes, empty, hollow. He stepped in, his clothes soaked, his face pale. "Where have you been?" Rachel's voice trembled. Brian didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the floor. Rachel's stomach twisted. She stepped forward, reaching for him. Then she saw it. The blood on his hands. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "What happened, Brian?" she whispered, afraid of what she might hear. He didn't answer. He just shook his head, as if he couldn't find the words. Rachel's mind raced. Her thoughts turned to the past few weeks. The tension, the arguments, the mysterious phone calls. He was hiding something dark. Her hands shook as she grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Tell me what happened," she demanded. But Brian's lips barely moved, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen. Rachel's pulse quickened. Her breath caught. "What do you mean it wasn't supposed to happen?" Brian's gaze shifted, locking on hers. The look in his eyes was not one of fear, but something colder, something more dangerous. "She's gone, Rachel," he finally muttered. Rachel's mind struggled to make sense of his words. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" she asked, her voice rising. "Who's gone?" Brian stepped back, his eyes flickering with panic. Rachel felt the world spinning. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling, the rain battering against the windows. And then the silence. The deafening silence in the room. Rachel could feel the walls closing in. The realization began to dawn on her. Her pregnant sister, Emily, was missing. But she hadn't just disappeared. No, this was something else. Brian knew more than he was letting on. And whatever it was, Rachel wasn't prepared for the truth. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak beneath her. She couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, twisting the words Brian had just spoken. "She's gone," he said again, his voice breaking. Rachel shook her head, not wanting to believe it. No, you're lying," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Brian's eyes dropped to the floor, his hands still trembling, the blood on them still fresh. Rachel's stomach lurched. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the room, searching for answers. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "Tell me, Brian," she begged, her voice cracking. He raised his gaze, his eyes hollow, as if he were lost in some deep, dark place. I didn't mean for it to happen," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Rachel stepped closer, her hands gripping the back of the chair to steady herself. "What happened?" she demanded, the words barely escaping through the lump in her throat. Brian swallowed hard. The tension in the room was suffocating. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but then silence. It stretched out, heavy, oppressive. Then he spoke. I didn't want her to know," he whispered. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Know what?" she pressed. The fear in Brian's eyes deepened. "The affair with Emily," he whispered. Rachel froze. Her body went numb. Her mind refused to accept what she had just heard. The world seemed to tilt, everything spinning out of control. Brian and Emily? Her own sister? The room around her blurred, her vision narrowing as the weight of his words crashed into her. "You're lying," she breathed, shaking her head violently. "Tell me you're lying." Brian's eyes filled with regret, but there was no denial. There was no excuse. Rachel felt the bile rise in her throat. Her sister, the one who had been pregnant with Brian's child. How long had it been going on? Rachel could feel the walls closing in around her. The house that once felt like home now felt like a prison. Her mind screamed for answers, but there was no escape, not from the truth. Brian's eyes turned dark as he looked at her. "I didn't want to hurt you," he murmured, his voice cold. Rachel's hands were shaking uncontrollably, and then, as if her body was no longer her own, she took a step forward. She had to know, had to understand what had happened to her sister, had to know how deep this went. But before she could say another word, Brian spoke again. "She's dead, Rachel." And in that moment, her world shattered. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Dead. She couldn't breathe. Dead. Her mind struggled to process it. Her sister, Emily, gone. Rachel felt the room spin, her vision blurring. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. Brian's confession echoed in her ears. He had said it. Her sister was dead. But how? Why? A million questions flooded her mind, but none of them made sense. Rachel took a shaky step back, her chest tightening with panic. Brian looked at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't name. Regret? Fear? Guilt? She couldn't tell. "I never meant for it to happen," he said again, his voice low. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What happened?" Her voice shook with desperation. Brian clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "I was going to leave," he whispered. "I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know." Rachel's mind raced as the pieces fell together. He was talking about Emily, the affair, the pregnancy. But it wasn't just that. Something darker was unfolding. Rachel felt her legs weaken, her knees threatening to give way. "I never wanted her to get pregnant," Brian said, his voice hollow. I couldn't leave you, Rachel. I didn't know what to do. And then she found out. I didn't know what she'd do." Rachel's stomach twisted, her head spinning. Brian's words were like poison, seeping into her mind. His guilt, his fear, and yet there's something else in his eyes, something she couldn't understand. "Brian, what did you do?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away. His hands trembled. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Rachel took another step forward, unable to hold back the rising tide of panic. She had to know. She had to know what happened to Emily. Finally, Brian spoke. "It was an accident," he said, his voice hollow. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't. But she was so angry, Rachel. So angry." And then his words trailed off, and Rachel's heart stopped. "What do you mean, and then?" she demanded, her voice rising. Brian turned away, his face contorted with something close to anguish. And then he said it. "She's in the woods." Rachel's breath hitched. The woods. Her stomach turned as she tried to comprehend his words. "Brian, what are you saying?" she choked out. "She's gone, Rachel. I didn't know what to do. I tried to bury it. To bury her. But..." He turned back to her, his eyes wild now, desperate. "It's too late now." The air in the room felt like ice. Rachel stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her legs were shaking, her mind a blur. "Brian, you," her voice trembled, struggling to form the words. He was talking about Emily, her pregnant sister. In the woods, her body in the woods. The horror of it sank deep into Rachel's chest. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, as she took a step back. The reality of what Brian was confessing to was sinking in, but her mind refused to fully grasp it. "You're telling me you left her there," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. Brian closed his eyes briefly, as though fighting to keep his composure. "I didn't know what else to do," he said softly, his voice shaking. Rachel felt a sharp, burning anger flood through her, so strong it almost choked her. "How could you?" she spat, her voice rising in fury. "How could you do that to her?" "To me." Brian winced as if the words were knives. "I didn't mean for any of this," he muttered. "I swear, Rachel, it was all an accident." Rachel's head spun. An accident? But no, this was no accident. Rachel's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. This was no mistake. This was a choice. A dark, terrible choice. "And the blood on your hands, Brian," she whispered, her voice shaking with disgust. He flinched at the question, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I panicked," he admitted, looking away. "I didn't know how to fix it, so I ran." Rachel took another step back, trying to steady herself, but her vision blurred with disbelief. "You left her there," she whispered. Brian nodded, his shoulders sagging with guilt. "But you can't tell anyone, Rachel," he begged, his voice pleading now. "You don't understand. I didn't want to hurt you. I love you." Rachel felt the words hit her like a punch. Love. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, had just confessed to something unimaginable, and now he wanted her to keep it a secret. She felt sick. Sick with the betrayal. Her sister was dead, and now Brian wanted her to bury the truth too. "Why didn't you come to me, Brian?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you come to me when she found out? You could have told me. We could have figured this out together. But you," her voice broke, "you let her die." Brian stepped closer, desperation flashing in his eyes. "Please," he begged. "I never wanted this. I just—" But Rachel couldn't listen anymore. The anger inside her burned too hot. Her sister was gone. The man she had loved was a stranger. She turned and ran for the door, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. She had to find Emily, had to know the truth. And nothing would stop her. That Rachel's footsteps pounded against the floor as she rushed toward the door, her mind screaming for answers. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but she didn't stop. The night air slapped her face as she burst outside, the storm still howling around her. She didn't care about the rain. She didn't care about the cold. All she could think about was Emily, the woods. She had to get there. Now. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The wind whipped through her hair, but she barely noticed it. The only thing that mattered was getting to the woods. Brian's voice echoed in her head. "She's in the woods." The words kept repeating, over and over, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. As she reached the edge of the property, her legs burned, but she pushed forward, her desperation driving her faster. The path to the woods was dark, the trees towering overhead like dark sentinels. The branches reached out like skeletal fingers, scratching at her skin as she ran past. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat urging her forward, urging her to find Emily, to find the truth. Her mind raced. How could this have happened? How could Brian do this? She wasn't sure how far she had gone, but she didn't care. She just needed to find her sister. The woods felt alive around her, every sound magnified in the silence. A snap of a twig under her foot made her jump, but she didn't slow down. The trees grew denser, the shadows darker, and then she saw it. A clearing. Her breath caught. In the center, just beyond the trees, she saw something dark against the earth. A body. Rachel's heart stopped. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady as she rushed to the spot. The rain fell harder, the wind screaming through the trees, but it all felt distant now. Her hands shook as she knelt beside the body. It was Emily. Her sister was cold, pale, and lifeless. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't look away. This was real. Emily was really gone, and Brian had done this. She felt a wave of nausea hit her. The truth, all at once, crashing over her. She had to get back, had to confront Brian. But as she reached for her phone, her hand froze. A rustling sound behind her. Rachel turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Someone was there. Someone was watching her. The wind stopped. The woods were suddenly silent. Rachel stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. A figure moved through the trees, and in that moment she knew. This wasn't over. The figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible through the torrential rain. Rachel's heart raced in her chest as her breath caught in her throat. She could barely make out the outline of the person, tall, hooded, moving with a sense of purpose. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her phone, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. She couldn't take her eyes off the figure. It stepped closer, the heavy crunch of its boots in the wet, leaves the only sound breaking the silence. Rachel's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt frozen, rooted to the ground. The figure stopped just a few feet away from her, the hood concealing most of their face. But Rachel felt the weight of their gaze. The air was thick, heavy. The rain beat down harder, yet there was an unnatural stillness surrounding them. "You shouldn't be here," a voice rasped from under the hood. It was deep, cold, and unfamiliar. Rachel's stomach twisted in fear. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they stepped forward, their movements deliberate, almost predatory. Rachel's breath hitched. The feeling of being trapped gnawed at her insides. "I could ask you the same thing," the figure said, voice dripping with menace. Rachel's hands clenched into fists, her mind racing for an escape. She knew she couldn't run now, not with Emily's body so close. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to mask the terror that surged through her. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, with chilling calmness, they took another step forward. "You're looking for answers, but some things are better left in the dark." Rachel's blood ran cold. She could barely process what they were saying, her mind still reeling from the sight of Emily, her sister, dead. "I know what happened," Rachel spat, her voice shaking but filled with newfound defiance. "I know who you are. You're the one who helped him, aren't you?" The figure didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "I'm just here to make sure you don't tell anyone what you've seen." The words sent a chill down her spine. Rachel's eyes darted to Emily's body, then back to the figure. She realized then, with a sinking dread, that this wasn't just about Brian anymore. This was bigger. The figure smiled beneath their hood, a dark, almost imperceptible curve of the lips. Rachel's breath caught, and in that instant she understood. The storm, the woods, the lies. This wasn't just about her sister. This was about keeping secrets buried. And it wasn't just Brian who wanted to hide the truth. It was someone else, someone much closer than she realized. The figure stepped even closer now, almost within arm's reach. Rachel's heart pounded. The world around her seemed to shrink, the forest closing in like a trap. "Don't worry," the figure whispered. "You won't be able to tell anyone ever again." And just like that, Rachel knew she was no longer in control. Her blood ran cold as she felt the weight of what was coming. The figure's presence loomed over her, suffocating her, like the very air had thickened with menace. Rachel's breath hitched, her mind reeling. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The figure stepped even closer, their body almost pressing against hers, the cold, damp air between them palpable. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs were frozen, paralyzed by fear. The hooded figure's voice was low, almost a growl, as it murmured, "You should have never come here, Rachel." The words wrapped around her, tightening like a noose. Rachel's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the situation, but her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. She had to think. She had to survive. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, her voice shaky but desperate. "You don't know who I am. I'm not just some random person. I can—" But before she could finish, the figure raised a gloved hand, silencing her with a single motion. "There's no more room for negotiation," they said, their tone final, cold. Rachel felt the sharpness of their words like a blade, cutting through any remaining hope. Her heart pounded louder. Was this it? Was she going to die here in the woods, just like Emily? No. She couldn't let this happen. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Rachel's body snapped into action. She turned and bolted toward the trees, her feet slipping in the wet mud. The rain pelted her face like needles, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, the figure moved, but it wasn't fast enough. Rachel pushed forward, her breath ragged, her legs burning as she sprinted through the forest. She had no plan, no escape route, but she had to try. The woods around her blurred, the sound of the rain drowning out everything else. Her pulse raced, her thoughts scattered like debris in the storm. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away from the figure, from whoever had been hiding in the shadows. But then, a sound, a crack, a snap of a branch. She stopped dead in her tracks, her blood running cold. They weren't alone. Another figure emerged from the darkness. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Two of them. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just being hunted by one person. They were everywhere. "Give up, Rachel," a voice echoed from behind her. It was a different voice, gruff, low. "You can't outrun us." Her chest tightened, the air thick with panic. She couldn't breathe. The darkness around her closed in. Her mind raced for a solution, but it was like being trapped in a nightmare, where every escape route was blocked. The woods, the storm, the figures closing in. Rachel's legs wobbled, but she refused to let herself collapse. Not yet. She had to fight. She had to survive. And then, a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. A third figure. This time, she could see their face, just barely, through the mask of rain. It was Brian. His face was twisted with something unrecognizable, his eyes wild with fear or anger. Rachel couldn't tell. He wasn't the man she thought she knew. He wasn't the man she loved. "Brian!" she screamed, her voice breaking through the storm. He didn't respond. His hands were trembling as he stepped forward, his face hollow. "Don't fight it, Rachel," he said quietly. This was always going to happen. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Brian wasn't just involved. He was part of it. This was bigger than just a secret. This was a trap. And Rachel was the prey. Her breath came in frantic gasps as the reality of the situation settled in. Brian, he was one of them. The same man who had held her in his arms, who had promised to love her forever. Now he stood before her, part of this twisted nightmare. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, pleading for an answer. "Why are you doing this?" Brian's eyes flickered, a brief moment of conflict flashing behind them before it was replaced with cold resolve. "You don't understand, Rachel," he said, his voice distant, almost robotic. "It's bigger than you, bigger than all of us." The words sliced through her, but the desperation in her chest burned hotter than ever. "No," she shot back, her voice breaking. "No, this is not bigger than me. You can't do this. You can't hurt me and expect me to just accept it." His eyes narrowed, and the mask of indifference slipped. For the briefest second, he looked almost sad. "You have to understand, Rachel," he repeated. But this time, there was a tremor in his voice. "There's no other way. I couldn't just walk away. Not from everything we've built. Not from the life I promised you." Rachel took a shaky step back, her heart thundering in her chest. The figures, each one closing in, didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. And Brian, standing at the center of it all, was the key, the one who could end it, or make it worse. "Please," Rachel begged, her voice breaking, "don't make me do this." But Brian didn't budge. Instead, his eyes darkened, and his lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm sorry," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for you to be a part of this. But you're already too deep." Rachel's chest tightened, panic rising like a tidal wave. She was trapped between the figure closing in on her from every side, and the man she had once trusted, who had become a stranger. Her hands trembled at her sides, and for a moment, all she could think about was Emily, her sister. Her sister's life had ended because of these people, because of Brian's choices. Her body burned with the need for justice, but also the raw, overpowering instinct to survive. "Please," Rachel's voice quivered, but her eyes were fierce. "I won't be part of this. I will make sure the world knows what you did. I will expose you." Brian's gaze hardened, but his eyes flickered briefly, uncertainty creeping into his stance. "You don't get it, Rachel," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something darker. "It's not that simple. You have no idea how far this goes. If you try to expose us, you won't be the only one who pays." Her pulse raced, and the weight of his threat crashed down on her, chilling her to the core. Suddenly, she saw it. Something in Brian's posture. Something that wasn't just the man she loved. He was afraid, too. Afraid of what they would do to him. Rachel felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. Brian was no longer the one in control. He was a victim, just like her. And the real power was in the shadows, the ones who had pulled the strings from the very beginning. They were the ones who had made sure Emily never had a chance. They were the ones who had been watching Rachel all along. Without another thought, she bolted. No more words. No more hesitation. She sprinted past Brian, her feet slipping on the muddy earth, but she didn't stop. The figures were closing in, but this time, Rachel was done with fear. She didn't know what was waiting for her at the end of the woods, but it had to be better than this suffocating nightmare. And then, as she ran, her thoughts were interrupted by a single sound, distant but unmistakable. A car engine. Someone was here. Her heart skipped. Whoever it was, they might be the key to escaping this nightmare. With renewed energy, she pushed forward, praying the figures wouldn't catch up in time. She didn't look back, not once. But then, from the shadows behind, the voice called out, "Run, Rachel. Run as fast as you can." It was Brian, and somehow she knew. She wasn't alone anymore. But neither was Brian. Rachel's heart thundered in her chest as she pushed her legs harder, the sound of the car engine growing louder. She could see the headlights now, slicing through the storm, illuminating the rain-soaked trees. A surge of hope pierced through her panic. She wasn't alone. Someone was coming. She had to reach the road. Every muscle in her body screamed with the effort, but she didn't dare stop. The figures were still behind her, but their footsteps faltered. They weren't moving as fast now. Maybe they were hesitating, or maybe they knew she had no chance of outrunning them. But Rachel couldn't afford to think about that. Not now. The headlights were so close, so blinding, and Rachel's breath caught as she stumbled forward, her shoes slipping in the mud. The figures were silent now. Too silent. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart hammering against her ribs, and that's when she saw it. Brian. He was standing just behind her, his hand reaching out, his face twisted with desperation and something darker. Anger? Fear? She didn't know, but it didn't matter. He was too close. "Brian, no!" she screamed, her voice raw, the words tearing through her throat. She didn't stop. Her legs moved on their own now, propelled by pure instinct. She had to keep going, had to reach the car. But then, as if in slow motion, something snapped in the darkness. A scream. The sound cut through the night, so sharp and sudden that Rachel froze mid-step. The scream echoed again, distant but unmistakable. It was Brian. He was shouting something, but the words were lost in the wind. Rachel's blood ran cold. She didn't dare stop to look, but her instincts told her she couldn't let him get caught. Not like this. Not after everything. And then a figure emerged from the trees. The one she hadn't seen before. Tall, cloaked in darkness. They moved swiftly toward Brian. Rachel didn't know who they were, but they didn't look like they were here to help. Her breath hitched. This was bigger than she had thought. It wasn't just Brian and the others. There were more people, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings, waiting for the right moment to strike. Without thinking, Rachel pushed forward, her feet pounding the wet earth, her eyes fixed on the car ahead. She had to reach it. She had to survive. With one last desperate burst of energy, she launched herself toward the headlights, her fingers outstretched toward salvation. The car slowed to a stop in front of her, and the door flew open. A woman's voice, breathless but urgent, called out to her. "Get in." Rachel didn't hesitate. She jumped inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The woman in the driver's seat was unfamiliar, but Rachel could feel the urgency in the air, the sense that they were both in danger. The car jerked forward, speeding down the narrow, rain-slicked road, the headlights cutting through the storm. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind racing to catch up with everything that had happened. She turned to the woman next to her, eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she gasped. "Why are you here? What's happening?" The woman's face was grim, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, her hands gripped the wheel with tense precision, her eyes scanning the road ahead, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Sarah. I've been tracking them for months." "Tracking who?" Rachel whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Sarah's eyes flickered toward her, her jaw tight. "Tracking them," she repeated. "The ones behind all of this." Rachel's mind spun. The ones behind it all. She thought she knew the truth, thought she had it figured out, but now, more than ever, she realized how deep the web went. And it wasn't just about Emily. It was about something much bigger, something dark and dangerous. The car sped through the rain, but Rachel felt no relief. Not yet. Because deep down, she knew the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. The car's engine roared as it sped through the rain, the tires skimming over the slick road. Rachel's hands gripped the seat, her fingers white from the pressure. She glanced at Sarah, whose knuckles were pale against the wheel, her face set in grim determination. Rachel could still hear the storm outside, the thrum of the wind, the constant hiss of rain hitting the windshield. But the silence inside the car was heavier than the storm itself. The woman next to her was a mystery, a shadow in the dark. But Rachel didn't have time for questions. Not now. She had barely escaped with her life. "Sarah," she finally managed to croak. "What do you mean, tracking them? Who are they?" Sarah's gaze flickered for a brief moment, her mouth tightening. She didn't answer right away, as if weighing how much to reveal. How much was too much. "They're not who you think they are," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady, but Rachel could hear the undertone of fear beneath it. "This goes beyond your sister, beyond Brian. You're tangled in something much bigger than you can imagine." Rachel's mind reeled. Brian wasn't just some confused accomplice. Emily's death wasn't just a tragic mistake. This was a conspiracy, a network of people with power and influence, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Her stomach twisted, a pit forming in her gut. "But what does it all have to do with me?" she asked, her voice strained. "I don't understand. Why me?" Sarah's eyes darted to her briefly, then back to the road, her hands tightening even further on the steering wheel. "Because you're the key, Rachel," Sarah said, her voice low, almost afraid to say it aloud. "You're the one who can stop them." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Me? But I don't even know who they are. I don't—" "Exactly," Sarah interrupted, her voice a little sharper now. "That's why you're the only one who can expose them. They never thought you'd make it this far. They never thought you'd survive this long." Rachel didn't know if she should be comforted or terrified. She felt both. The car swerved slightly as Sarah sharply turned onto another road, one that was even darker, the trees pressing in closer to the sides. "But they won't stop," Sarah continued, her eyes flicking to Rachel. "You have to know that. They'll hunt you, track you, until they finish what they started. They won't rest until you're silenced." Rachel's hands shook, her thoughts scattered like confetti. The fear of what she had just escaped was still fresh in her chest. But now, with Sarah's words, something new bloomed within her. Determination. No, she couldn't let this go. She couldn't let them win. "But why should I trust you?" Rachel demanded, her voice hoarse. "How do I know you're not working for them, too? You could be one of them." For a split second, Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. Then she sighed. "Because I've seen them. I've watched them destroy lives. I've been trying to take them down for months. And I can't do it without you." The weight of her words hit Rachel like a ton of bricks. She stared at Sarah, her pulse thundering in her ears. The mystery woman had to be telling the truth. What choice did she have but to believe her? But even as Rachel's resolve began to harden, a new dread crept in. The woods, the figures, Brian, none of this was over. The storm was still raging outside, but Rachel knew, deep down, that the real storm was just beginning. Sarah glanced at her again, her voice tight but urgent. "You need to prepare, Rachel. They're going to come after you. But we can't fight them from the shadows anymore. We need to expose them for what they are, before they silence everyone." "Everyone!" Rachel repeated. The realization hit her all over again. Emily, her sister, was only the beginning. How many others had been hurt by this same network? How many had vanished without a trace? The night outside was a blur of rain and darkness, but in that moment, Rachel felt more awake than ever. She wasn't running anymore. She was going to fight. And somehow, someway, she was going to bring down the people who had destroyed her life, and countless others. She glanced at Sarah, her breath steadying. "Let's do this," Rachel said, her voice firm. Sarah nodded once, her eyes dark but resolute. "We're going to need help," she said quietly. "We're going to need allies, and we're going to need to dig deep into the places they've hidden for years. But we have to start now. The longer we wait, the more people they'll take." The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel felt like she had a purpose again. The chase was on. And this time, she wouldn't stop until the truth was out, until they were exposed. Until she made sure Emily's death meant something, the car rumbled on through the rain-soaked night, the world outside reduced to blurred shadows and streaks of light. Rachel's thoughts raced, each one tangled with the next. She wasn't sure what exactly she was walking into, but one thing was clear. This was a fight she couldn't back down from. "We need to find out who's behind all this," Rachel said, her voice steady, though her heart still hammered in her chest. "Who's at the top?" Sarah glanced at her quickly, her eyes flicking between the road and Rachel. It's not just one person. It's a network. People you'd never expect. High up. Well-connected. Dangerous. The words hung heavy in the car. Dangerous. Rachel shuddered, the weight of that reality settling deeper into her bones. Emily, her sister, had been one of their victims. But who else had fallen into their trap? How do we even begin to find them? Rachel asked, her fingers curling into fists. We'll start by going through their history, Sarah replied, her voice firm. We need to find their patterns, their connections. They've been operating under the radar for years, but there are traces. People who know, people who've tried to stop them. Rachel nodded slowly. She had no idea what she was getting into, but every instinct told her she couldn't turn back. Not now. The car turned sharply, and Sarah slowed to a stop in front of a small, dimly lit house. The wind howled outside, but the silence inside the car was heavy, like a breath being held. Stay close, Sarah warned, her eyes scanning the dark road behind them. Rachel didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the car and followed Sarah to the door, her nerves on edge. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every movement felt like it could be the last. Sarah knocked once, then twice. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a man standing in the threshold. His face was weathered, eyes sharp but tired, as if the weight of too many secrets had aged him before his time. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice low, as if someone might be listening. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "Rachel's ready to help us. We need everything you have." The man studied Rachel for a moment, his eyes calculating. Then he stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. Inside, the small house was cluttered, papers and files scattered everywhere. A dim light hung overhead, casting long shadows that made the place feel even more suffocating. The man led them into a back room, where a large corkboard covered one wall, littered with photographs, maps, and strings connecting various points. Rachel's eyes darted over it, trying to make sense of the web before her. "Who are they?" Rachel asked, her voice tight. "Who are these people they've hurt?" The man ran a hand through his hair, his face weary. "They've erased most of their traces. People vanish. Family members turn up dead. But we've found a few who escaped their grasp." He gestured to the board. "We've pieced together fragments, names, connections. They're too deep in the system for anyone to touch." Rachel stepped closer to the board, her eyes falling on a few names. One caught her attention immediately. Brian. Sarah's gaze flickered to Rachel. "We thought it was a long shot, but everything points back to him. He's the link. He's been a part of this operation for a while." The perfect cover. Rachel's throat went dry. She had been right all along. Brian was deeper in this than she'd ever imagined. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, shock, confusion. How had it all gotten this far? How had he gotten so deeply entangled in something so monstrous? But there was no time to dwell on it. The truth had to come first. "We need to find where they're hiding," Rachel said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find where Brian's been taking orders from." The man, who had been silently watching, spoke again. "We've been tracking his movements, but he's careful. Very careful. We don't know where they meet, but there are whispers. Places that come up again and again." He paused. "They've been hiding in plain sight, right under our noses." Rachel swallowed hard. Her pulse was a constant throb in her ears. She had to do this. She had to finish what Emily started, finish what Brian had started, even if it meant facing him. Sarah turned to her, her expression serious. "Are you ready to go deeper, Rachel? There's no turning back once we start." Rachel glanced around the cluttered room, her eyes landing on the photos of people she didn't recognize, people who had vanished, people who had been silenced. Her mind flashed back to the figures in the woods, the shadows that had haunted her every step. She could feel them still, lurking in the edges of her mind, waiting to strike. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. "I'm ready," Rachel said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Let's finish this." Sarah gave her a sharp nod. "Then we move tonight. We find the one person who can give us the answers we need. But after that, Rachel, we go after them all." With a deep breath, Rachel steeled herself for what lay ahead. This was no longer just about Emily. This was about everyone who had been taken by the darkness. And Rachel was going to be the one to bring it into the light. The air was thick with tension as Sarah led the way, the map of their next steps already burned into her mind. Rachel stayed close, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house as they moved toward the back door. The storm outside still howled, the wind slapping the windows as if trying to warn them. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice tense. "We find the location tonight. We take the first step toward ending this." Rachel nodded, though her mind was a blur of questions, doubt, and fear. But above all, there was something else now. Something colder, sharper. Determination. They climbed into the car, the wheels screeching as they pulled away from the house. The road ahead was dark, twisting, a path that seemed endless in the torrential rain. Rachel kept her eyes fixed ahead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. "You're sure about this?" Sarah's voice broke into her thoughts. Rachel glanced over, the question still hanging in the air. "I'm sure. No matter what happens, I won't back down. This has to end." Sarah's eyes softened, but her hands remained tight on the wheel. "It will. But Rachel, this isn't going to be easy. The closer we get, the more dangerous it becomes. These people won't let us expose them without a fight." The words echoed in Rachel's mind, a cold reminder that she was no longer just an innocent bystander in a tragic story. She was now part of something far more dangerous. "We'll find a way," Rachel said, her voice steady, even if her heart raced. The hours passed in a blur. Every road felt like it led to nowhere, and every shadow seemed to stretch further, darker, waiting. When Sarah finally turned down a narrow dirt road that was barely visible in the night, Rachel felt the shift in the air, like something was drawing them in, like they were crossing an invisible line into enemy territory. The headlights of the car illuminated an old, decaying building in the distance. It loomed in the distance like a forgotten memory, the structure so worn that it seemed like it had been abandoned for years. But Rachel could tell this was no ordinary place. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice tight, almost fearful. "This is where it all started. The place where they make their moves." Rachel's stomach dropped as they slowly pulled up to the building. It was eerily silent, save for the soft patter of rain against the car windows. The trees around them seemed to close in, their branches like twisted arms reaching out. "We have to go in quietly," Sarah whispered as she parked the car. "No unnecessary risks." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding as she stepped out into the rain, her shoes slipping on the wet ground. She stayed close to Sarah as they approached the entrance, the building looming like a tomb. They crouched behind a crumbling wall, their breath shallow, as they peered through the broken windows. Inside, the faint flicker of lights danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "I don't see anyone," Rachel muttered, her pulse racing. "We're not here for them," Sarah replied, her voice low. "We're here for the files, the evidence. This is where it all connects." Rachel's eyes scanned the area, her mind a whirlwind. "What do you think they're doing here? Why keep this place hidden? They're too smart to keep everything in one place. But they underestimated the people who've been watching. They underestimated us." Rachel swallowed hard, steeling herself. She had no idea what to expect. No idea what kind of horrors they might uncover in that building. But they had to do it. The stakes were too high, the danger too real. They crept inside, moving as silently as possible. Every step felt like it echoed through the empty halls, the silence pressing in on them. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs of people Rachel didn't recognize, but they were all connected by something, a thread, a darkness that stretched back years. As they moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, their very presence suffocating. Suddenly they heard it, a low hum, a voice. Someone was talking. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. Sarah motioned for her to follow, leading her into a back room. There, a row of filing cabinets stood, locked and covered in dust. "This is it," Sarah whispered, pulling out a set of keys. "The files are in here." As Sarah unlocked the cabinets, Rachel couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The tension thick in the air. The hum of voices grew louder, and Rachel's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. They had to hurry. "Here," Sarah said, pulling open the first drawer. The papers inside were neatly stacked, old but well-preserved. She flipped through them quickly, her eyes scanning the documents. Then she stopped. Rachel stepped closer, her heart skipping a beat. "Here," Sarah said again, holding up a folder. It was thick, filled with documents that looked like they had been hidden for years. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is the proof." Rachel took the folder from her hands shaking as she flipped through the papers. Names, dates, locations. Everything was connected. And there, at the bottom of the last page, was the name that would change everything. Brian. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The final link. And the truth was darker than she had ever imagined. They weren't just hunting them. They were hunting everyone. Everyone who knew. And now, Rachel was in too deep to turn back. The room seemed to shrink around them as Rachel stared at the name on the last page, her hands trembling. Brian. It was there, clear as day, a signature at the bottom of a document. An official-looking file with dates and locations, all pointing to places Rachel hadn't seen, but could now feel creeping into her life like a poison. She ran her fingers over the paper, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she was looking at. This wasn't just about a few corrupt individuals. This was a web, a system, and Brian was at the center of it. Rachel's stomach twisted into knots. Asterisk why? Why had he done this? Asterisk the man she loved, the man she trusted, was tangled in this mess. The betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut. The cold realization that nothing in her life had been what it seemed. What is it? Sarah's voice was sharp, urgent. Rachel's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Brian's name, he signed this. He's been a part of this from the start. But why would he do this? Sarah's eyes hardened, her jaw set. Because he's not who you think he is. You were never meant to know. He's been playing both sides, helping them and helping us, all while staying under the radar. It's a dangerous game. Rachel's thoughts were spinning. The realization that Brian had been playing both sides was a dagger to her soul. Had everything between them been a lie? Had their love been part of his cover? Her breath quickened, but she forced herself to focus. There was no time for self-pity. Not now. She glanced at the papers again, her gaze narrowing. What do we do now? How do we use this? If Brian's involved, he's bound to know we're here. Sarah's expression softened, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only a cold resolve. We need to get this evidence to the right people, Rachel. The ones who can expose the entire operation. But we can't trust anyone who might be tied to them. No law enforcement, no allies. They're everywhere, and they'll stop at nothing to keep this hidden. Rachel's pulse quickened at the weight of Sarah's words. They're everywhere. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't just running from the shadows anymore. She was standing in the heart of it. But something inside her hardened. She could do this. Emily hadn't been able to fight back. But Rachel? Rachel would be the one to tear this all down. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the hallway, a faint creak, followed by footsteps. Sarah's eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her toward the far corner of the room. They crouched in the darkness, breath held, hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Rachel could hear the faint murmurs of voices now. It sounded like more than one person. "Who's there?" a voice called from the hall. It was low, authoritative, and unmistakably familiar. Rachel's blood ran cold. "Brian," his voice. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Sarah's grip tightened on Rachel's arm. "Stay quiet," she whispered urgently. Rachel's mind raced. Why was he here? He had to know what she was doing, what they had uncovered. He wouldn't just let her walk away. He couldn't. The door creaked, and Rachel's breath caught. The figure in the doorway was cloaked in shadow. It was hard to make out the details at first, but as the door creaked open further, the outline became clearer. Brian stood in the doorway, his face half lit by the dim glow from the hallway, his eyes locked with Rachel's. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world outside that room had faded, and all that existed was the tension between them. Rachel's heart pounded, but she didn't look away. "I knew you'd find it," Brian said, his voice low, controlled. But there was something in it, something that sent a chill running down her spine. "You knew I'd find the truth." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to speak any louder. The betrayal, the shock, it was suffocating. Brian's eyes flickered briefly to Sarah, then back to Rachel. "I didn't want this for you, Rachel. I didn't want you to know, but I couldn't keep hiding from it anymore. They were going to make me choose." Rachel's hands trembled, the weight of his words settling over her. Choose. What was he saying? "Choose what, Brian?" she demanded, her voice sharper now, no longer holding back the rawness that had been building inside her. "What have you been doing? Who are you working for?" Brian exhaled, taking a step forward. "I was trying to protect you, Rachel, but now you're involved too. There's no turning back. Not for either of us." Rachel's mind raced. No turning back? "Stay away from her." Sarah's voice was cold, protective. She stepped in front of Rachel, her eyes locked on Brian with a quiet fury. "If you think she's going to let you control her, you're wrong." Brian didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, though it was devoid of warmth. "You think this is about control? No, this is bigger than both of us. It always has been." The words felt like daggers. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as she realized the horrifying truth. Brian wasn't just part of this dark network. He was its puppet master. And now, he was standing in front of her, ready to pull her into the heart of the storm. "You're too deep in this, Brian." "This ends tonight," Rachel said, her voice trembling but resolute. But as she spoke, she could feel the walls closing in. And for the first time, Rachel truly understood. The danger wasn't just out there. It was standing right in front of her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every breath Rachel took felt like it could be her last. Brian's presence, his calm, unshakable demeanor, was like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. But Rachel wasn't backing down. "You don't get it, do you?" Rachel's voice wavered, but her words cut through the air with a quiet force. "You've been lying to me from the start. You, Brian, you are the reason this nightmare is happening. You were the one who pulled me into all of this." Brian's gaze darkened, but he didn't flinch. "I didn't have a choice, Rachel. You think I wanted this? I didn't want to hurt you. But you don't understand the forces we're up against. This," he gestured around the room, "this is just the beginning. You've seen what they can do." Rachel's heart raced as she took a step forward, pushing past Sarah, her eyes never leaving Brian. The anger in her chest was growing, bubbling to the surface. "I don't care what you thought you were doing, Brian. You've dragged innocent people into this. You've ruined lives. Emily's life. Brian's jaw clenched, but for a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something. Regret? Guilt? It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced with that same cold, calculating look. I didn't want to hurt Emily, he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that seemed almost real. But she was too close. She started to ask questions. I didn't have a choice. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a blow to the gut. Brian had been involved in Emily's death directly. He was the reason her sister had disappeared. Her sister had known too much. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in even tighter. Her vision blurred with a rush of tears, but she blinked them away. There was no time for weakness. Not now. Why didn't you just tell me? Rachel choked out. If you really cared about me, about us, why keep me in the dark? Why make me a target too? Brian didn't respond immediately, but his silence was deafening. I did it because I love you, he finally said, his voice low, strained. I never wanted you to be a part of this, but when they came after you, I had no choice. I had to make sure you were safe. Safe. Rachel's laugh was bitter. You think this? She gestured wildly at the room, at the papers, at everything they had uncovered. You think this is safety? Brian didn't speak, but there was something in his eyes, a mix of fear, guilt, and something else, something far darker. You don't understand, Rachel. You're in danger now. You're already too deep. I can't protect you anymore. No one can. Rachel's chest tightened. She shook her head, refusing to let the fear creep in. She was done running, done hiding. And if Brian thought he could manipulate her into staying quiet, he was wrong. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady, the fury in her chest pushing her forward. You don't get to control me anymore. I'll bring this whole thing down. I'll expose everything, everyone. Brian's face hardened, the faint flicker of hesitation vanishing. You think it's that easy? They'll kill you, Rachel. They'll kill anyone who gets too close. You don't even know who you're dealing with. These people have been in control for years. They have power. They have reach. Sarah stepped forward now, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rachel. We've been through hell already, and we're not backing down. Not when it's this close. Brian took a step back, his eyes darting between the two of them. You think you can stop them? His laugh was bitter, filled with resignation. You're already too late. Before Rachel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway again. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Someone's coming, Sarah whispered urgently. Her eyes flashed with panic. We need to move. Now. Brian's expression shifted, the calm mask slipping away. He cursed under his breath, clearly torn. But then, without another word, he turned, disappearing into the shadows of the building. Rachel felt her pulse race as she looked at Sarah. He's running. We need to follow him. He knows something we don't. Sarah shook her head, grabbing Rachel's arm with surprising force. No, we're not chasing him. We're getting out of here now. We've got the evidence. That's all that matters. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something far bigger. Brian had just slipped through their fingers, and if they didn't act fast, they'd lose him, and the answers forever. Another set of footsteps, heavier now, pounded down the hall. Rachel turned to Sarah, determination hardening her resolve. We can't just let him go. Not again. But Sarah's expression softened with a warning. Rachel, listen to me. If you go after him, you're walking into a trap. They'll use him to lure you in. We need to get to the safe house. We need to get this evidence out. You can't let him manipulate you any longer. Rachel hesitated, her mind torn between the need for answers and the danger that was closing in. But deep down, she knew Sarah was right. This wasn't just about Brian. It was about everything. She had to finish this. With a final, reluctant glance at the hallway where Brian had disappeared. Rachel nodded. Okay, let's go. But as they turned to leave, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. The walls felt like they were closing in as they made their way back through the darkened halls. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside seemed amplified in the silence. The urgency in Sarah's steps matched Rachel's pounding heart. She could feel the weight of the evidence in her hands, the folder with the damning papers, the threads that could unravel everything. They moved quickly, the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty building. The air was thick with tension. They had to get out before it was too late. Rachel glanced over at Sarah. How much farther? Sarah didn't answer immediately, her face set, eyes scanning the shadows around them. She knew this place too well, had been through it before. But tonight there was something different in the air, something dangerous lurking just beyond their reach. This way, Sarah muttered, turning a sharp corner toward the exit. Rachel followed, her mind racing. Brian's words echoed in her ears. You're already too late. The weight of that threat hung over her like a cloud. She had to stay focused, had to keep moving, but doubt gnawed at her. What if he was right? What if there was no escape? They reached the back door. Sarah pushed it open slowly, glancing outside to make sure the coast was clear. The storm had subsided a little, but the wind still howled, trees bending under its force. It felt like nature itself was on edge, warning them of the danger that waited just outside. As they stepped out into the night, Rachel's nerves were on fire. The car was just a few yards away, parked under the trees where the shadows swallowed them whole. Every step felt like it could be their last. Rachel's eyes flickered to Sarah, her voice a whisper in the wind. What now? Where do we go? Sarah's gaze was hard, her jaw tight. We head to the safe house. We get this evidence to the right people. Then we disappear. No more chasing shadows. No more games. Rachel nodded, trying to push the weight of everything out of her mind. She had to trust Sarah. The evidence was their ticket. They just had to survive long enough to make it count. As they neared the car, Rachel's breath caught in her throat. There was a figure standing near the vehicle, just outside the light. The shadow was tall, its form cloaked in darkness. A chill ran down Rachel's spine, and her pulse spiked. "Who is that?" she hissed, her voice shaking. Sarah froze. Her eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively moving toward the gun at her side. The figure stepped forward into the dim light. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It was Brian, but something was different. His eyes, once filled with conflict, were now cold, detached. His posture was stiff, almost military. "You didn't think you'd get away that easily, did you?" he said, his voice low, too calm. Rachel's blood ran cold. "Brian, no. What are you doing? This isn't you. You can still stop this." He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. "Don't," Sarah warned, her hand on her own gun now, her voice firm but quiet. Brian's lips twitched in something like a half-smile. "You're wasting your time. They've already found out what you've done. You're running out of time." Rachel's mind raced. Asterisk who? Who had found out? Asterisk. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" Brian continued, his eyes narrowing at Rachel. "You don't understand. I never wanted any of this. But now, there's no turning back for either of us. You're part of this whether you like it or not." "You're wrong," Rachel spat. "I'm done. Done being your pawn. Done being part of your twisted games. I know the truth, Brian. I know what you've done." Brian's face darkened, his fingers tightening on his weapon. "You don't know the whole truth, Rachel. You don't understand what they're capable of. They'll come for you. They'll come for all of us." Rachel's heart raced, but she held her ground. "I don't care. I'm not afraid of them anymore. I'm not afraid of you." Brian paused for a moment, his expression flickering. It was almost as if he were reconsidering something, something that might have been buried deep inside him. But then, as quickly as the softness appeared, it vanished. His features hardened again, and he stepped forward. "I tried to protect you, Rachel, but it's too late now." Without another word, Brian drew his weapon. The sound of metal clicking echoed in the night air, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Rachel's breath caught, her instinct screaming at her to move, to run. But before she could react, Sarah was already stepping in front of her, her gun raised, aiming directly at Brian. "Stay back," Sarah warned, her voice low and steady, her finger hovering over the trigger. Brian's eyes flicked between the two women, calculating. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop them?" Sarah's voice was cold. "If I have to, I will." Brian hesitated for a moment. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. His footsteps were swallowed by the darkness. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "He's gone," she whispered, though her mind couldn't quite catch up with the sudden shift in the air. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sounds of the storm as it finally began to subside. But Rachel knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real danger was just beginning. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice low, her grip tight on her gun. "We're not safe yet. Not until this is all out in the open." Rachel nodded, her eyes focused on the road ahead. Her heart still raced. But there was a new fire inside her. She was going to finish this, no matter what it took. And as they got into the car and drove away into the night, Rachel knew one thing for sure. Brian wasn't just a part of the game. He was the key to ending it. The engine hummed to life as the car roared through the deserted streets, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Rachel's hands gripped the seat, the weight of the night settling over her like a thick fog. Every passing second felt like a countdown. They hadn't seen the last of Brian. That much was certain. The question that gnawed at Rachel, however, was what exactly had Brian been trying to protect her from? What was this shadowy organization that had its claws so deep into everyone's lives? And why was Brian so determined to keep her out of it? She glanced at Sarah, who was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched tight, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, every inch of her alert. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but Rachel could tell from the way her muscles were taut that the storm inside her had not subsided. "We can't outrun them forever," Rachel murmured, her voice tight. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flickered to Rachel before returning to the road. "We're not outrunning them. We're going to expose them. All of them." The confidence in Sarah's voice surprised Rachel, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. She had seen too many secrets unravel, too many lies that had led to the death of Emily, to the destruction of everything Rachel had once known. "What do we do now?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We stick to the plan," Sarah said firmly. "We get the evidence to the right people, and we make sure it gets into the hands of someone who can't be bought, someone who isn't under their control. If we don't, we're as good as dead." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "And you think we can trust anyone?" Sarah hesitated, and for a split second, Rachel thought she saw something flicker in her eyes, something that resembled doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the steely resolve that defined Sarah's every movement. "I don't know," Sarah finally said, her voice quieter now. "But we don't have much of a choice. The people who are still on our side are few, but we can't let them win." Rachel leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her breathing. The cold wind outside seemed to seep into the car, making everything feel colder, more suffocating. The flickering streetlights outside cast long, stretching shadows across the road, each one making Rachel feel as though she were being hunted. Suddenly, Sarah's sharp intake of breath made Rachel sit up straighter. Her eyes locked onto the road ahead, where a set of headlights appeared in the distance. "Is that—" Rachel began, her voice catching in her throat. Sarah's hand tightened on the wheel. "We're being followed." Rachel's pulse spiked. The headlights grew closer, too close, and Rachel's instinct screamed at her to act. "Go faster," Rachel urged, her heart hammering in her chest. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She slammed her foot down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as the engine roared to life, a surge of power coursing through it. But the headlights kept getting closer. Too close. The pursuit was relentless. "What the hell is going on?" Rachel gasped, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror as the car behind them closed the distance. It was a black sedan, sleek and ominous, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah's expression was stone cold, but Rachel could see the tension in her shoulders. "They must have found out we have the evidence." Rachel's mind raced. "Do we have a plan B?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're running out of time." The car behind them wasn't backing off. Its headlights blazed, reflecting off the wet road as it stayed on their tail. Every turn they took, every swerve, the car followed, like it had been tracking their every move from the start. "We need to lose them," Rachel said, her voice shaky but urgent. Sarah nodded, her gaze never leaving the road. "Get ready." In an instant, she swerved the car to the right, heading into a narrow alley. The tires screeched as they turned sharply, and Rachel's stomach lurched at the sudden change in direction. The car behind them followed, its engine growling like an animal closing in on its prey. "Hold on," Sarah shouted as she jerked the wheel, sending the car flying around another corner, speeding down a dark, nearly empty street. Rachel's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as they careened through the city. She glanced back at the pursuing car, her stomach knotting with fear. The sedan wasn't slowing down, wasn't giving them an inch. It was right on their tail. "Are we close?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Sarah's eyes flicked to her, dark with a mix of frustration and determination. "Almost." The car shot through another turn, tires screeching again as they sped toward an intersection. Rachel barely had time to register what was happening before Sarah slammed the car to the left, narrowly avoiding a collision with a streetlight. But the sedan didn't back off. The sound of screeching tires was deafening as the car behind them surged forward, forcing Sarah to veer left again, swerving dangerously close to the curb. "We need to lose them now," Sarah growled, her voice tight with anger. Rachel's mind raced, trying to think of anything that could save them. But before she could speak, a burst of bright light flooded the car, momentarily blinding them both. A car. Another one. It was blocking their path. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The walls were closing in. The game was over. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, a voice broke through the night. A voice Rachel knew all too well. "End of the road, Rachel." Her breath caught in her throat as the car behind them stopped. The man in front of them stepped out of the car. Brian. And he wasn't alone. That Rachel's heart dropped into her stomach. Her blood ran cold as Brian stepped out of the car, flanked by two more figures who had emerged from the shadows. The streetlights cast their faces in harsh, unforgiving light. Their expressions were unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. Brian's eyes locked onto Rachel's, cold and distant. There was no hint of warmth, no trace of the man she had once known. This was someone else entirely, someone who had buried everything he cared about to serve a higher, darker cause. "Brian," Rachel's voice trembled, but she fought to keep it steady. "What do you want from me? Why won't you just let me go?" Brian didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, staring at her with those piercing, emotionless eyes. The two men beside him didn't move, but they were watching Rachel and Sarah with unnerving focus, their hands twitching near their weapons. Sarah's hand rested lightly on her gun, her posture tense. "You're making a mistake, Brian," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't you. This isn't who you are." For a brief moment, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of hesitation in Brian's eyes, but it was gone too quickly. The coldness returned. "I did what I had to do," Brian said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "You don't understand, Rachel. You're not the only one with a stake in this. You think this is about you? You're just a pawn. They've been watching you for years." Rachel's mind raced. They? Who were they? The words swirled around her head, but they made no sense. She had to stay focused. She had to figure out what was going on. "You're wrong," Rachel spat. "You've been lying to me from the start. You've been using me to cover your tracks, to keep your secrets safe." Brian's gaze didn't waver, but there was something almost sad in his eyes now. "I never wanted to drag you into this, Rachel. I never wanted to hurt you, but you were too close. You were always too close." Rachel clenched her fists. "What are you talking about? Close to what?" Brian's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Close to the truth. You don't realize it, but you're part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine." Her mind was spinning. The truth? What truth? The two men beside Brian took a step forward, their movements stiff, deliberate. They had no intention of letting Rachel and Sarah leave. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Brian said, his voice still eerily calm. "But you have no idea who you're dealing with. None of us do." "Not really." Rachel's pulse raced, the panic rising again, clawing at her throat. This wasn't just about Brian. There was something darker at play here, something much more dangerous than she had anticipated. Brian knew something she didn't, and he wasn't going to let her walk away from it. Her eyes darted between Sarah and the men blocking their path. Sarah's face was set, her jaw tight, but Rachel could see the slight shift in her stance. She was ready for anything. "We don't have time for this," Sarah said. Suddenly, her voice clipped. "Rachel, get in the car. Now." Rachel didn't need to be told twice. She turned toward the car, adrenaline pushing her forward. But before she could take 2 steps, one of the men lunged, grabbing her by the arm with a vice-like grip. "No," Rachel screamed, trying to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. "Let her go," Sarah shouted, her hand already on her gun, her voice raw with fury. But before Sarah could act, Brian raised his hand. "It's over, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "You're out of your depth. This goes beyond anything you can handle." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she didn't lower her gun. "You're making a huge mistake, Brian. You will regret this." Brian shook his head slowly. "No, Sarah. You will regret it." The man who was holding Rachel tightened his grip, pulling her toward Brian. She struggled, kicking, but he didn't budge. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. Asterisk, this wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be caught like this, asterisk. And then, just as the world seemed to close in around her, Sarah moved. In one swift motion, she drew her gun and fired, the shot ringing out in the still night air. The sound echoed through the alley, and the man holding Rachel stumbled back, clutching his arm. He let go, and Rachel broke free, stumbling backward. "Get in the car," Sarah shouted, her voice urgent. Rachel didn't need any more encouragement. She bolted for the car, scrambling into the passenger seat, her heart pounding. Sarah slammed the door shut, her eyes wild as she threw the car into gear. "Go. Go now," Rachel screamed, her hands trembling as she looked over her shoulder. Brian stood in the street, his expression unreadable, as Sarah floored the gas pedal. The car screeched away, tearing down the alley and onto the main road. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps as the car swerved around corners, the headlights casting long shadows on the street. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel Brian's eyes on her, burning through the rearview mirror. They weren't safe. Not yet. We can't outrun them forever, Rachel said, her voice tight. We need to find a way to stop this. Sarah's grip on the wheel tightened. I know, but right now we get as far away as we can. After that, we end this. Rachel nodded, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead of them. And the truth was darker than anything she had ever imagined. The road stretched out before them like a dark ribbon, twisting and turning through the night. The car's engine hummed steadily, but Rachel's heart was a frantic drumbeat in her chest. They couldn't keep running forever. They couldn't keep pretending they could escape the storm that was coming. The silence between her and Sarah was suffocating, filled with unspoken thoughts and rising tension. Rachel's mind was racing, her eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. They had to do something, anything. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her jaw clenched with a quiet fury that was only just holding back the panic. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Sarah broke the silence. "They're not going to stop until they have us," she said, her voice steady but strained. "We need a plan." Rachel's mind was spinning, but one thought kept cutting through the chaos. Brian, he had been trying to protect her. But protect her from what? From who? And what did he mean by everything he said about the truth? What had they been hiding all along? "We can't outrun them," Rachel whispered, almost to herself. What if we give them what they want?" Sarah's eyes flicked to her, narrowing in suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Rachel's throat tightened as she forced herself to speak. "The evidence. The folder. We could give it to them, but we'd have to make sure we're not the ones who get taken down in the process. We use it against them, expose them for what they are. But we need leverage. We need to know who else is involved." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "It's risky. They're not just going to let us walk away with the truth." Rachel shook her head. "No, they're not. But we could turn the tables." Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel as she took a sharp turn, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. "If we're going to do this, we have to move fast. One wrong move, and they'll find us before we even have a chance to get the truth out." Rachel nodded, her stomach sinking. This was it. The point of no return. There was no going back from this. The headlights in the rearview mirror gleamed, cutting through the darkness, getting closer, closing in. "We have to stop them before they stop us," Sarah muttered. "Before they silence us." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Asterisk, this was it. This was their only chance, asterisk. They had to act, or they would lose everything. The night felt suffocating as the car sped down the darkened streets, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. Rachel's heart raced, each beat louder than the roar of the engine. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. Every decision, every lie, every shadow that had followed them for so long. It was almost over. She could feel it. This was the moment when everything would either collapse into chaos or finally make sense. But what if the truth they were chasing was too dangerous to face? What if they weren't ready for it? The thought gnawed at her, a pit forming in her stomach. Beside her, Sarah's hands were steady on the wheel, her face etched in concentration. She wasn't going to let this slip away. Rachel had known that much from the start. Sarah had always been the one to push forward, to do what was necessary, even when it was brutal. "We're almost there," Sarah muttered, her voice clipped. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, where the headlights of the pursuing car still burned brightly. "Get ready." Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered now was getting to the meeting point where the evidence could be handed over. There was no turning back after that. They were on their own. As Sarah took a final turn, the car came to a sudden stop in front of an old warehouse, its windows dark, its exterior decayed from years of neglect. This was the place, the one where the truth would be revealed. Rachel's hand trembled as she gripped the door handle, her breath shallow. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. "Once we step inside, we don't come back out the same." Rachel swallowed hard. "I'm ready." But as she opened the door, a chill ran down her spine. Was anyone ever really ready for the truth? They stepped into the night, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The shadows surrounded them, but neither of them looked back. There was no time for hesitation. In the distance, the headlights loomed closer. They had no choice but to face it now, together.